you. The honourable member for Cypress Hill Grassland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm glad that I've got an opportunity to speak to this bill, and I look forward to my colleague from Dauphin Swan River, Neepawa, being able to speak to this too. He's probably one of the most knowledgeable members in the House on these issues. And first of all, Madam Speaker, I want to point out that GMO-free labeling is allowed in this country. I mean, from the conversation that we're having here today, Canadians might not understand that, and those people who are listening, but any company, any wholesaler, any retailer can put GMO-free labeling on their products if they choose to do that, if they think that that is somehow going to impact the market in a positive way for them. They have the opportunity to do that, and we see people doing that across Canada. I'm from a farm. I'm very proud of the heritage that I have. I'm proud of the crops that my neighbors produce. And Madam Speaker, it's good tonight. I've even got some constituents in the neighborhood watching this, and so it's good to have them here because they understand the challenges that farmers across Canada face, that producers have as they're feeding the rest of the world. We've always guided our agriculture and food safety policy when we're in government, and the policy that we have as a party on the principle that decisions must be based on science. And they need to be based on sound science, and this actually results in Canada having one of the best food safety systems in the world. Now, this government apparently seems determined to leave that behind. We've had a number of issues come to the Ag Committee that do not seem to be science-based at all. They've been more politically based, and I think if we're going to be making decisions about these kinds of products and about chemicals and pesticides and those kinds of things based on political activity, we're going to find ourselves in a very deep hole. And so at the Ag Committee, we've dealt with things like the neonicotinoid issue. We're dealing with animal transport regulations issues, and the government's proposals do not deal directly with science. Much of it seems to be politically motivated, and if we start to do that, we walk into a very deep swamp, and particularly if we start to do that with genetically engineered products. So with respect to food safety, Madam Speaker, particularly around the GMO products, the role of the government has been, and it should continue to be, to regulate for the health and safety of Canadians. And that's what we have been challenged with. That's the challenge that the governments have typically taken up, and that's where they have said that their involvement and their interference, if you want to call it, in the market needs to stop. And so that's why we have the kind of food safety system that we do in this world. We stand for the integrity of the food system. We think that we've got a great food system here. We stand for protecting the health and safety of Canadians and for our farmers as well, so that they can continue to be competitive around the world. But the reality is that GMOs have been demonstrated time and time again to be no threat to human health or to human safety. And this bill, Madam Speaker, fails to acknowledge the safeguards that are already in place, as well as the labeling options, one of which I mentioned a few minutes ago, that are already available to manufacturers and producers. Now, we've had some questions this afternoon about some of the science or whatever, but I just want to point out that there are over 2,000 studies that have been done that document that there is no threat to human health or food safety from GMOs. And interestingly, in the U.S. animal ag industry, one of my Liberal colleagues a little bit earlier asked about studying whether if animals are eating GMO products, that they should then be considered to be GMO in some fashion. But in the United States, animal agriculture, each year, they produce over 9 billion food-producing animals, and 95% of those, Madam Speaker, consume feed containing GMO ingredients. Now, since the introduction of these genetically engineered products, trillions of meals have been fed to animals of GMO products, and if there was an issue, Madam Speaker, it would have become obvious long ago. There's one study over 29 years studying 100 billion animals, livestock productivity and health show that there is no noticeable impact of genetically engineered products, other than in cases where there has been basically an improvement. There's no impact on meat, there's no impact on milk, there's no impact on eggs, and clearly the benefits of GMO crops greatly outweigh the health impacts. For example, the use of GMOs on farms in our area have reduced the price or the price of food. They lower the requirements for energy input. They've raised the outputs of crops. We have an example of something called golden rice, which could directly impact 1 million children per year, 1 million deaths of children per year who suffer from vitamin A deficiency. And this product, there are a number of governments who have said, well, they're just not going to grow it because it's GM. no matter how much it could impact in a positive way their people. Some people oppose this and still try to make the genetically engineered part of that the issue, and that's what this bill does as well, but there is no issue. I think it's important noting, we've mentioned the European Union here a couple of times today already. The EU itself has funded over 130 research projects, so you'd expect, given kind of requirements they have, that they would have probably been really interested if there were any negative impacts of these products. They were carried out by 500 independent teams, and not one of them found that there was any special risk from GMO crops, and that's from Scientific American. So the objections that we find to this, Madam Speaker, to this whole industry are not scientific, but they are definitely political. I'm a little concerned about the NDP coming forward with this bill again. It's come a number of times, but I really feel like, if anything, they're persistent, if not accurate. And there is no health issue. We shouldn't be leaving that impression with people that there is. We also shouldn't be leaving the impression that the United States at this time requires genetically or modifying for GM products, because that's not true. The requirement that they do have down there is that if you actually had a compositional difference that's taken place that results in some sort of material change to the product, then that has to be labeled for that change. And that's a far cry from what we're being asked to support here. I guess an example of that would be if, for example, you had a canola oil that had an increased lauric acid content compared to conventional oil, it would have to be labeled as a laureate canola oil. So that's not what we're talking about here. To say that the United States has GMO labeling is not to be accurate, and I don't think that the mover of the bill or others here should be leaving that impression. Madam Speaker, his bill leaves no definition of GM food. In the bill, it actually leaves that to the Governor and Council. I don't think that it would be responsible for us to be supporting this bill. It just puts it forward with no definition of these terms that, once again, we need to see. We need to understand what is it that he's talking about. Why would he just say, we don't believe in anything specific enough here to even define it. We're just going to throw it over to the government and let them somehow decide what the definition of this is. So he has a GM labeling bill, but he refuses to even consider defining what GM means in his mind. And so we don't have any clear understanding of what that might be. As I mentioned earlier, it has been important for the Canadian system to regulate not by health, but by safety. And or rather, they have regulated by health and by safety, but not by composition. And I don't think that we need to change that, because this has worked well in the past. In his bill as well, he decides to leave all regulations to the Governor and Council as well. So basically, he's just saying, we want a bill, I guess, but we're going to leave it to the government to define what it's about. We're going to leave it to the government to set the regulations. And it's kind of a strange presentation here. I think this is just a first step to try to get this bill in as quickly as they can. So, Madam Speaker, I just wanted to point out one thing, that the reality in the United States, I want to come back to this because I think it's important, because we've heard this a couple of times today, is that they don't make distinction between novel foods and GMO foods. So novel foods are typically new products that have been developed. Their view is that foods developed using new techniques do not differ from other foods in any meaningful way, or present different or greater safety concerns than foods developed by traditional plant breeding. So that's a pretty direct repudiation of the fact that that he's saying that there is GMO labeling required in the United States. So, Madam Speaker, I want to give a little bit of time later for my colleague from Dauphin Swan River Neepawa to be able to speak at length here. So I'm going to wrap up right now and let him have the extra time, hopefully later, that I was given.